Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Elizabeth DeWolf. I'm acting director of the Maine Women Writers Collection. And on behalf of the collection and our curators, Sarah Baker, and on behalf of the University of New England, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Donna M. Loring lecture. This year, our topic is Maine's Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations. Established in 2019, the Permanent Commission examines systemic racial disparities in Maine and serves to advise all three branches of Maine government on public policy changes that would make racial equity a central consideration in Maine lawmaking. But first, let us begin by acknowledging that we are holding this event in Wabanaki territory, this beautiful, bountiful, inspiring land that so many of us call home. Acknowledging this, however, is just a starting point. Those of us who are settlers here have a responsibility to listen and to learn from the past and from the present, and to use our privileges, our new knowledge, and our resources toward dismantling the structures of colonization. And today's event is one small step, and it's made possible by Donna Loring and by today's guest speakers. We are very grateful to all of our speakers today for joining us. Allow me to say a few words of introduction of our guests. Our host today is the Honorable Donna Loring, a Penobscot Nation Tribal Elder and former council member. From her work representing the Penobscot Nation in the Maine legislature for over a decade, to her hosting of Wabanaki Windows on WERU, to her leadership of the nonprofit Seven Eagles Media Productions, supporting the accurate media representation of Wabanaki culture and history, to her work as senior advisor on tribal affairs to Governor Janet Mills, Donna Loring has devoted herself not only to public service, but to raising public awareness of and dismantling institutional discrimination against Wabanaki people. She holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Maine, Orono, and received the Alumni Career Recognition Award from the University of Maine Alumni Association. She's also received a Deborah Morton Award from UNE for her exceptional leadership in civic, cultural, and social causes. She was recently recognized with the annual Courage is Contagious Award from the Maine School of Law. In 2009, she entrusted UNE and the Maine Women Writers Collection with her personal, professional, and literary papers, and worked with us to institute this annual lecture series, a profound gift that has become an extension of her life's work. We are honored to welcome two additional distinguished guests to today's conversation. Representative Rachel Talbot Ross is a 9th-generation Mainer who has dedicated her career to public service and social justice. In addition to serving as the City of Portland's Director of Equal Opportunity and Multicultural Affairs for more than 2 decades, she led the NAACP in Maine and founded several nonprofit organizations, including Maine Black Community Development, Maine Freedom Trails, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Fellows. Representative Talbot Ross chaired the Maine State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, as well as the Advisory Committee for the African American Collection of Maine, which is housed at USM. Representative Talbot Ross is currently serving her 3rd term in the Maine House, where she serves the Democratic caucus as Assistant House Majority Leader. And she is the first and only Black woman elected to the Maine legislature and to legislative leadership. As a lawmaker, she has worked extensively on justice reform and has shaped critical conversations about equity for all Mainers. She sponsored successful legislation to create Maine's Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations, which she now co-chairs. She also secured passage of landmark bills to include racial impact analysis in the legislative process and expand tribal legal authority over domestic violence against Native Americans. Representative Talbot Ross has been awarded UNE's Deborah Morton Award for Exceptional Civic Leadership and the 2020 Gerda Haas Award for Excellence in Holocaust and Human Rights Education and Leadership. She was also named the 2020 Woman of the Year by Emerge Maine and received the 2021 Wayne Fleet Klingenstein Alumni Award. Welcome, Representative Talbot Ross. Ambassador Maulian Dana was appointed by Penobscot Nation Chief Kirk Francis in September 2017. As ambassador, she acts as a representative of the Penobscot Nation and serves as a liaison for the nation at the local, state, and federal levels of government to educate and advocate for policy and laws that impact and protect the Penobscot Nation's sovereignty, culture, natural resources, and the general welfare of the Penobscot people. Prior to serving as ambassador, she served as an elected member of the Penobscot Tribal Council. Ambassador Dana grew up on Indian Island within the Penobscot Nation's reservation. She graduated from the University of Maine in Orono with a degree in political science. Welcome, Ambassador Dana. So today, Donna Loring will facilitate today's conversation and will hold all the questions, and I'm sure there'll be many, for the end. If you are watching today through this Zoom webinar, you can enter questions for the speakers into the Q&A section. From UNE Facebook's page, you can enter questions in the comments. And here I'll thank Kathleen Miller, UNE Education and Outreach Archivist, and Maine Women Writers Collection Curator Sarah Baker for facilitating our question and answer session. Now, before we end promptly at 1 o'clock, we'll try to include as many questions as we can. I'd also like to just take a minute to thank Lee Cody and Dave Dadiego in UNE's Office of Communications for making this virtual event possible. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education and Megan Grammer, Alan Bennett, and Maureen Miller in the Office of Communications for helping us get the word out on this important conversation. And now I will turn the virtual microphone over to the Honorable Donna Loring. Donna.
Okay, had to unmute myself there. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really great to be here and to have my great niece, Ambassador Maulian Dana, I have to disclose that right off, and my very, very good friend, Representative Rachel Talbot Ross. So this year we thought it'd be very important to talk about the Permanent Commission because this commission is really, I think it's really historic in Maine policymaking. And I just pulled a few comments from their 2020 report. So I just read some so you get a flavor of what we're talking about. The Permanent Commission is empowered, this is important, to advise all three branches of Maine government. There is no process by which to guide those conversations or to analyze racial impact when bills are being considered. As a result, our state has not established sufficient policies to truly combat racial disparities for those who call Maine home. Good policymaking cannot happen without bringing everyone to the table, listening to experts, listening to those affected, and being open to acknowledging the underlying biases that exacerbate inequities. This process has been a powerful first step that can set the tone for how Maine legislators moving forward act. It is critical that this process be replicated, refined, and institutionalized. So with that, I'm going to ask Representative Talbot Ross the first question. I'd like you to begin, Rachel, by telling us how you conceived of this bill, why you thought creating a bill like this would be important.
Well, thank you, Honorable Donna Loring, for the invitation to join you today and to join Ambassador Dana in this very important discussion. It's truly an honor to serve with her as co-chairs of the Permanent Commission. And I want to thank the entire UNE family for having us here today. It's a very, very exciting to be able to talk about the work that we're doing on behalf of the Permanent Commission. So thank you all. I guess I would start with saying that when I first entered the legislature, what made me run for the legislature is best kind of understood by a quote from Dr. Cornel West. And he says, "Justice is what love looks like in public." And as a ninth generation African-American Mainer, I have seen laws being passed and not seeing a whole lot of change happen even as a result of good lawmaking. And part of why I went to the legislature was because first of all, I didn't see anybody who looked like me there. And but second of all, I hadn't seen justice show up and change any of the generational transference of poverty and disparities across all systems for people of color here in Maine. There was no movement in the needle unless it was exasperating disparities. And so there needed to be, when I went in, I said, one of my primary motivations was to try to institutionalize a process that would examine those disparities and then have the ability to move on them forward. So my first term, Donna, in the 128th, back in 2017, I did introduce two bills. I introduced the Permanent Commission bill, and I also sponsored a bill that would look at the wealth gap, trying to figure out ways to get at the economic inequities. Neither of those bills passed, so we came back in the 129th and put forth the Permanent Commission. It did pass, as you've noted, in 2019, and it brings us here today. The essential piece of the Permanent Commission, there's actually three essential pieces of it. One is that it has representatives of the federally recognized tribes as members on the commission. That was absolutely critically important to do the work of the commission, is to have the nations represented. The second component was that it would be advisory to all three branches of government. And then the third component was that it would serve as a think tank for people of color here in the state of Maine that would move research and analysis and policy development forward from our lived experience and our lens. So that's how we came to be. I'm very proud of the Permanent Commission and our ability to still be here today.
So the commission has quite a bit of leverage because it can create bills, correct?
That is correct. One of the things that we're all mindful of is the years, actually in hindsight, but the years that we've spent in this country trying to move a multicultural agenda forward, diversity, pluralism, all ways that we have spent decades of trying to realize, again, some of the laws that were created as race neutral, but have actually exacerbated disparities or not moved to eliminate the disparities. But we've all seen the work for decades on multiculturalism. It hasn't changed the outcomes. So it was really important that we created something that had the power to really examine systemic racism and at its root be able to call it out, identify it, educate the public on it, and then have the power to actually change it. And so one of the essential components of the Permanent Commission is that we can introduce legislation at any point in time during the legislative session to do exactly that. It's a very powerful and necessary tool, and there is nothing like it in the history of the state.
Well, I think they'd probably be not things a lot like it in other states as well. The other thing you guys can do is, and you have, and that is review bills and make recommendations. Now, I think that's important. So how do you do that? Do you review all the bills, or what's the process?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. When we came into existence in 2019, and then kind of turned the corner into the brutal murder of George Floyd, it really helped to crystallize our purpose. And at that time, the legislature was still in session. As you know, COVID had started to take over our lives in March of 2020. The legislature abruptly adjourned. It had to, and it left 450 bills on the table. At the time, we didn't know if we were going to go back into a special session later that fall, but we were charged by the former Speaker of the House, Sarah Gideon, at the time. If we were going to go back into special session, she really wanted us for the Permanent Commission to examine those 450 bills so that we just didn't go in and repeat all of the ways in which bills were analyzed as race neutral. So under her leadership, we did convene and we created a methodology for examining 450 bills. We went through them. That's what you've highlighted in the report. And we created a priority list of bills. Those priority list of bills, Donna, have also been reintroduced in the 130th, and we are monitoring all of those bills right now. We have a pretty elaborate system of tracking bills right now. We're tracking the several hundred of bills that have been carried over to next year. We also have statutory work that the legislature directed us. So we're actively working on 6 different bills. And we are getting ready to analyze the 330 bills that have just been submitted for the second regular term that starts next year. So several hundred bills will go through our process, a methodology that we designed in the next couple of months. And we will again produce a list of priority bills that we think will improve the outcomes of Maine's racial, indigenous, and tribal populations.
So my next question is going to be from Maulian, Ambassador Dana. Ambassador Dana, you are part of that commission. Can't see you. There you are. Part of that commission. So what's your experience with the commission, and how do you see that helping the tribes?
Great. Well, I'll echo all of the great sentiments from Representative Talbot Ross, and also you, my great aunt, Donna. Great to be here today, and just very thankful that this lecture carries forward in your name, and I think it's a great honor to you and our tribe. So I heard about the commission when the bill had passed, and I'm always very in awe of the leadership of Representative Talbot Ross. She's really not afraid to take a stand in a place where she says not many people look like her. And just her tenacity and fearlessness is something that I think a lot of us are very naturally drawn to. So when I heard about the commission, I knew that there would be tribal seats on it, and went through the process of being appointed to serve for the Penobscot Nation. And something I think that is great about it is that each tribe has their own seat on the commission. So it's not like we're going to have this one seat for Wabanaki people, which is great when it works out that way. But this is unique in that each tribe can bring their kind of unique experiences and goals. And there are some things we all really unite around, but on a commission where you're looking at the very distinct experiences of different marginalized communities, you really need to have each one of those communities have a voice. So I've really enjoyed serving with the fellow tribal commissioners and all of the commissioners, but it's been really great to hear about the needs and opinions from the other tribes that I might not get through our policy work that's usually centered on these bills that we're all, advocating for. It's been really great on a variety of issues to hear from the different tribal leaders on the commission. And I think it really serves the tribes well, because I know it's not a secret that the history of the relationship between the state of Maine and the tribes is tense, it's chaotic, it's often, in litigation a lot of the times. And my role as ambassador exists because in 2015, we had pulled our representative from the legislature after a lot of tension and chaos. And, kind of our last straw was Governor LePage rescinding the executive order for consultation. So my role every day, I'm very, very aware of the tense nature of this relationship. So I think that we're kind of constantly walking this delicate balance of how do we want to interact with the state of Maine for the good of our people without giving up any of that sovereignty, without feeling like we're under the thumb of the state, as they often have treated us through the interpretation of the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. So the Permanent Commission was appealing to me to get involved in, because it is empowered with a lot of great tools and mechanisms to advance a lot of our shared and unique interests without giving up any of our self-determination and self-governance. And it really feels like it enhances those good qualities about being inherent sovereign nations, talking to the state from a government to government place about the needs of our people.
Now, there was, this is to either one of you guys, there was a tribal sovereignty bill in last session. It was, I'm talking about the umbrella bill with like the 20 recommendations or whatever. Can either one of you speak to where that is right now? Rachel?
Well, I can, I'll quickly start just to give the where the status is for the bill. So that was LD 2094 from last session. That was a bill put together as a result of a task force, the tribal state task force, and it took all of about 20, a little over 20 recommendations, and it put it into LD 2094. That bill did not move forward in its entirety. It ended up being kind of split into a couple of other bills by the time we got to committee, and then we ended the session without taking any action on it. It has come back this term, LD 1626, which I'm absolutely a proud part of the team that's moving that forward, along with the leadership of Ambassador Dana. That bill has incorporated, again, those 20 plus recommendations into the bill. We carried it over so that in 2020, next year, we'll hold public hearings and try to move that bill forward. It's a very comprehensive bill that covers everything from taxation and land use and regulation to fishing and hunting. It talks about jurisdiction of the tribal courts. It is a sovereignty bill and looks at the rights, privileges, and powers that should be inherent, that are inherent, as a restoration of the inheritance of our tribal sovereignty. And I'll let Ambassador Dana expand on that, but it is a bill that if anyone listening or views this tape at any given time after today, the number one thing that you can do is help us pass 1626 and restore tribal sovereignty. The number one action that you can take right now is to make sure that that bill passes. So I'll pass it off to Ambassador Dana.
Thanks so much. And you covered it really well. I think just to give folks a little bit of background, if you don't have it, the bill was a result of a task force, and the scope of the task force was to study the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act And this has been studied a few times in these past 40 years. And what happened when this settlement was reached, essentially the Passamaquoddy tribe discovered first that the 2/3 of the state of Maine had been illegally taken from the tribes. The treaties were never ratified by the federal government. So in the late 70s, going into 1980, there was this, rush to reach some kind of settlement. Jimmy Carter was in office. He was likely to sign an agreement. Ronald Reagan was coming in after him and made it clear he would not sign an agreement. So the tribes had some misgivings about some of the language in the bill and worries about sovereignty, but also it wasn't clear they would ever get another deal or a better deal. The tribes did get money held in trust to purchase back land from the federal government, and it did extinguish those land claims. Something that should have just been about money and land went a bit further. There was language added that has prevented the tribes in Maine from having access to federal legislation that would benefit tribes since 1980, unless we are specifically named in it. And it's about as complicated and yucky as it sounds. So the tribes in Maine, even though we're entitled to those federal acts, have not been able to have access to them because of the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. So along with some of the jurisdictional issues, the tribes have been treated like municipalities for the past 40 years. We've constantly asserted ourselves as sovereign nations. There's also this piece, it's really undermined our status as federally recognized tribal nations.
And I would add one thing, Donna. It's the reason why we had to put LD 1392 forward last session, and it passed with the Violence Against Women's Act in order to give concurrent jurisdiction to the tribal courts with the state in prosecuting domestic violence as class misdemeanor offenses. But those piecemeal bills, we've had tribal gaming bills, as you well know, over the last since you've been in office, I'm guessing. But these piecemeal bills have to keep coming forward because we have not taken the right step to restore tribal sovereignty here in Maine.
So that's one huge area that your committee's looking at. And are you planning on going further into that, like maybe having some hearings on some of that stuff?
Well, for the legislature, absolutely. We opened the public hearing up this year. It sits with the Judiciary Committee, so a public hearing was opened up this year in which hundreds of people had wanted to testify. I think well over 100 had and submitted testimony in support of the bill. They voted to table the public hearing so that we can come back next year and reopen the public hearing and do a full examination of the bill. It also allows for the public to once again comment on the bill. And I would say that there's, from my perspective, the folks that I hear from, there's overwhelming support for the restoration of sovereignty and for the passage of 1626. The legislature has to catch up. I believe that the people of Maine want to see this through and recognize the inherent rights. It's the legislature that must catch up, and I dare say it's the executive branch that must respond. We really need to focus in on, even if the legislature passes the bill, as you know, Donna, the veto power of the governor looms over this bill. And so I would also say to the listening audience that if you have a relationship with the governor, that you make sure that you contact that office and speak about your support for this bill. And if you don't, reach out to either Ambassador Dana, myself, or the Honorable Donna Loring, get more information so that you know how you can help us take action on this bill. Yeah, I would just encourage the audience to do so.
So my question actually was, the commission itself is empowered to hold hearings, correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, we are.
Kind of like, it reminds me of the civil rights commission that you and I both were on at some point, the power that commission had to open hearings and sort of like investigate certain situations and get the really deep goings on of what happened, like the 1972 report they did on the state tribal, and that really was embarrassing to the state. And I've always thought that we should go back and take another look at where things are now compared to then. Anyway, just throwing that out. The other thing that the commission is doing, and Ambassador Dana, you have a role in this, and it's the climate change that you're looking at. You chair the subcommittee on climate change, is that correct?
The subcommittee on equity for the Maine Climate Council.
Okay, so tell us about that.
Sure. I was appointed to the full Maine Climate Council in its inception. And as the work went on, they had different working groups covering transportation, lands and waters, energy sector, and kind of all of these branches of climate change work. And eventually there seemed to be a missing piece, and that was this equity question. So they commissioned a report from the Mitchell Center, University of Maine, Orono, and the report was all about how do we measure equity outcomes as we approach this climate work? What language are we using? How do we appropriately account for the impacts on frontline communities in the state of Maine as we develop this huge climate report of recommendations? And before the full report was released, the Maine Won't Wait report, which I voted for and I'm very proud of, and I think it's a very bold and good climate plan. The chair of the committee, Hannah Pingree, asked me to possibly co-chair a subcommittee on equity to really do a deep dive into that report as a starting point, and also to produce our own findings and recommendations to the full Climate Council, which will happen early next year. So over the past year, we've been meeting monthly. Representative Talbot Ross serves on that committee. And we've kind of taken each working group of the Climate Council subject and dissected it from an equity standpoint. And we have a very diverse, great group of members on that committee, and a really great facilitator. And the Governor's Office of Innovation Policy in the Future has been super helpful in facilitating these meetings monthly. And what we've come up with are some really strong recommendations. I believe they're live on the Maine Climate Council website. And, they're all about, for example, we really like to get people using heat pumps and electric cars. What about people that really can't afford a heat pump and have never been to a car dealership to buy a new car? Things like that. Kids in rural Maine that really rely on school bus transportation. We're talking about switching over to greener transportation. Let's think about all of the children and how they're getting to school and what this looks like, whether it's, or people out in rural Maine that need to get to doctor's appointments and just lived in kind of these forgotten about places. And that work's been really fulfilling and gratifying. And another thing we're doing is there was legislation that was passed to look at, what does environmental justice mean and what are the disparities when talking about climate, and kind of in this realm of the Permanent Commission, how do we combine forces and address this climate change through an equity lens. So that's been kind of, codified in law, and we're all working together to come up with some workable definitions and looking at how to measure that in the future.
Okay. So what are there some other areas you guys are into that I'm missing here? Rachel?
Yeah, I would point out there right now, the Permanent Commission is engaged in six different areas of work that the legislature asked us to investigate and examine and come back with recommendations and perhaps bills that would move them forward. They around land use and land justice. There's a bill, LD 870, that was sponsored by Representative Bill Pluker, that really focuses on indigenous and African American generational experience around land, both land theft and land use, and the prevention of these two populations being able to acquire land. That's LD 870, and we're doing that work currently. Another bill, LD 1113, is to address the disparities in prenatal care. It is, for those who are listening, it's probably not well-known information, but the maternal care and prenatal care, access to reproductive services in the state of Maine is disproportionate for women of color. And so we're taking a look at LD 1113, sponsored by the Senator Ann Carney. Another bill that we're looking at, LD 1548, and I'm sorry for your listening public, we talk in terms of LD numbers. It's how we keep it straight in our head. So my apologies for that, but it does allow you to look this up and figure it and see the work that we're doing. So LD 1548 is a very important bill, which looks at not just the disproportionate impact of COVID, but what the bill actually does is says Maine has received billions of dollars from both the CARES Act and the American Recovery Plan Act, ARPA, billions of dollars. It's gone to the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, the Department of Corrections, state agencies. And we're concerned with the disproportionate ways in which the communities most impacted of COVID have been funded in terms of education, prevention, treatment, and then in the ongoing management of COVID-related illnesses. So LD 1548 really is akin to admitting that that racism is a public health crisis, and that during COVID we have these twin pandemics of COVID and systemic racism. That bill is going to drill it down into how much monies have gone to invest in our communities to help with the public health crisis. Very, very important bill. The other things that we're looking at is we'll be tackling some labor issues. This next session specifically focused on farm workers' rights. There are a number of water quality and water standards bills, a number of them that we will be looking at, and hope to give some support to the Passamaquoddy tribal nations fight for clean water. We're looking at codifying in LD 1226. We're looking at codifying restorative justice in the criminal code. We always hear about restorative justice as something within the juvenile justice world, but now we're looking at codifying restorative justice, defining it within the criminal code and throughout our education statutes. So those are some of the things that we're doing. One last bill I'll just give a little nod to is back in 1977, my father, when he served in the Maine State Legislature, and it's an ode to your work as well, Donna, he was able to get the prohibition of offensive names passed in Maine for geographical designations. And in statute, the N word, and I will say the S word, now is considered offensive names for any geographical place in the state of Maine. It's taken off all maps, public property. We have a bill in 1591 that will reinforce the offensive name statute because we discovered last summer 5 islands in the state of Maine, 3 that had the N word on them, 2 that had the S word on them. Were still on maps. And so whatever was put in place in 1977, it has not been strong enough to remove these offensive and despicable, horrific names on places in the state of Maine. And this is an ode to some of the work that you've done, Donna, during your tenure in the legislature. But that's some of the work that the Permanent Commission is doing. I'll just give one more piece of information around the Permanent Commission. Aside from the LD work, starting in January, we're pleased to be able to work with Esther Etienne and Panthea Burns at the Cutler Institute who designed the Truth and Reconciliation process for the Wabanaki tribes in child welfare. Took them 5 years to design the process and several years for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to exist. It's why we have Wabanaki Reach. We're pleased that we'll be working with those two brilliant minds to design a statewide truth-telling commission that will take us into a TRC process for the state for the next several years. And that will be the standing work of the Permanent Commission from starting next year for several years to come. So thank you for the opportunity to let your listeners know about the work that we're doing. No,
that's fantastic. That's great. I'm good. I'm glad to hear that. But I do want to make a correction here.
Okay.
The S-word bill was sponsored by Donald Soktoma.
You correct me on that all the time.
I do every time.
Donald
and I did work on it, but it was
Donald.
Bill. Yeah.
That's right. And your bill, though, around Wabanaki curriculum is the landmark bill that you worked on and got passed. I put your work and Donald's work and that of Wayne Mitchell's and others all in the the landmark bills that move forward with your leadership in the state legislature.
So there's another area that you haven't covered, and I think that you're looking at it. You guys you're all over the place, but
systemic racism, Donna. What can I tell you?
So you've got the law enforcement, court system, and the prisons. So that's huge. All of that.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. It's a lot to go into in a few minutes. But we have since we advised the judicial branch, one of the things, and Ambassador Dana can also jump in here around this, but one of the things that's been hard for us to do since the report came out last September, we have spent all of our time up until this very day. It's one thing to establish a permanent commission in name, in statute. It's another thing to make it operational. And we truly believe that the state of Maine, which has never explicitly invested in the elimination of systemic racism. You can't find it within the state's budget. It was very important to us that once we were named, that we could operate. And it was very important to us that public money be used for our operations. So we've spent the last year fighting for and did achieve getting the historic placement in the general fund for the state budget, of which now we are using to operationalize our mission and to hire staff and to do this statutory work that we've been charged with. But we've finally gotten that funding, and now we're turning the corner into trying to professionalize and actualize our work. A big step forward, historic, I would say.
Absolutely. And so you guys only have a couple of more minutes, so I'm going to just let you say your last things you want to say before we go on to take questions. So Maulian, I'll let you go next. Just talk about what you want to say, what you want to leave people with.
Sure. I think it's interesting that Representative, quoted Dr. Cornell West, because that's kind of a guiding principle for me too. Another one of my aunts a while ago said that my leadership style reminded her of his quote that to lead the people, you have to love the people. And I think that's why co-chairing this commission with Representative Talbot Ross, our philosophies are very much in line. And I think we have very deep love and deep roots in our communities and in our people that we're serving. And also it's been great to hear the experiences of other commissioners and see where we can align on things and where we can support each other. And something that's been so remarkable about this process is that, people of color in Maine have been oppressed and marginalized and silenced for tribal people. It's in our homeland. And coming together to elevate all of our voices, I think has been something very special to be a part of. And I'm really honored to be doing this work. And it is a lot of hectic work right now. And my hat's off to Representative Talbot Ross for handling a lot of the day-to-day administration, really, and just keeping it running until we have all the staff in place. But things are ramping up quickly, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Great. Rachel?
Thank you again, Donna, for the opportunity to be here today and talk about, as Maulian said, this is part of our loves of our lives. This is how we live our lives, by doing this work. And I cannot think of anyone better to do it with the ambassador. As you were talking, Ambassador, about, I started to hear my mother's voice in my ear. And one of my mother says for her that freedom is the ability to tell the truth, her truth. And she sees, the ability for people of color to be able to tell their truths and to not have to sacrifice their souls in it is what freedom is. And I think that for all practical purposes, that's the way I think about the Permanent Commission, is we are on a mission to tell the truth, and then to let that truth guide us into a new reality, and in some ways restoring a reality, right? But that's the business we're in, truth telling, which leads to freedom, which is about justice. And it's not just a saying. I'm not trying to. It's not just the latest lingo. Every commissioner on the Permanent Commission, and we've been together now for 2 solid years. This is our life's work, and we take it very seriously, and we hope we're doing the best work on behalf of the people of Maine. So thank you.
Thank you. So Sarah, you're hopping in here.
Great. Well, we have a very engaged audience. So we have a few questions about LD 1626. Could you provide examples of advantages that it will provide? How will it change the lives for the tribes, gaming, fishing, and hunting?
Let Ambassador Dana.
Sure. So kind of the overarching theme of 1626 is bringing the tribes in Maine to a place of fairness and equity with all of the other federally recognized tribes in the country. And in reading about the Settlement Act in 1980, the negotiators, the team from the state of Maine, really wanted to make it so that if there's any ambiguity about jurisdiction, that the state of Maine laws would hold over tribal lands and tribal people. So as far as like fish and game, taxation, criminal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, we do have laws and practices in our tribal communities, but it's often very cloudy, and we often, don't have the rights and the control over our lands and people that we really should have. So say a crime happened on tribal land, if the person committing the crime was not a tribal member, we would not have the jurisdiction to try them in tribal court. So, it's examples like that. If somebody came into our land and was hunting, if they were not a tribal member, it might be hard for us to persecute them and to have any kind of consequences for them, coming into our lands and trespassing or hunting. So it's complicated, but it's not. And as far as taxation, should this pass, we would have the ability to control our sales tax and business tax and those sort of things on tribal land with tribal members. So I think a lot of the opposition to this bill is fear mongering sometimes, like we could, do these crazy tax breaks on Indian Island and kill all the surrounding businesses and other towns. Or if our employees were non-tribal, we could do kind of shady tax practices. But it's really just about jurisdiction and self-determination over kind of our communities, our lands, and our people. And it's also about having access to those federal beneficial acts. And something that we were able to get done in a separate law was, dealing with land acquisition. And that's a whole other topic. See, in the Settlement Act, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscots were each allowed to buy back 150,000 acres of land. Neither tribal nation has been able to acquire that amount of land. And I want to recognize Representative Rena Newell from the Passamaquoddy tribe, who's joining us today, who had a brilliant maneuver in Judiciary Committee. There was a bill in to extend the time period for us to acquire those lands. And Representative Newell introduced an amendment that would do away with those limits. And that was able to be passed into law. So land acquisition is still kind of on the table in the larger piece, but we were able to get that done. So it's very complicated. I would encourage you to look at the Wabanaki Alliance website to kind of flesh out the individual areas in the bill, but that's kind of a brief description.
Ambassador, if I could add just one other thing about 1626, one of the most important pieces for me is the consultation piece as well. And what that means is that state agencies cannot take any action that will directly impact tribal sovereignty without consultation with the tribes. So it's a pretty important piece. Moving forward, that is the relationship that should happen between the state and the tribes is through consultation. Yeah.
Great. So as a follow-up, do you have a sense of when in 2022 the hearing for LD 1626 would take place?
Well, thanks for that question. Yay, somebody ready to act. I love that. So I would just echo what the ambassador just said. Please, visit the Wabanaki Alliance, sign up for, notifications from their website, but also you can go to maine.gov, you can go to the legislature's page, and you can sign up as an interested party on the Judiciary Committee's list. And that way you will get notification of not just 1626, but also any other bill that the Judiciary Committee will take up. That's the best way to know when the public hearing will be scheduled. I don't have that information. We haven't even started the second regular term. We won't do so until the beginning of January. But we're hoping it's early in the session, because one of the things that happened, unfortunately, to this bill this year was that it was scheduled so late in the session that it was a very, 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 it impacted our ability to really engage the legislature and that full committee on the bill. So next year, we're hoping that it gets scheduled early in the session so that there's plenty of time for public debate and consideration. But sign up, visit Wabanaki Alliance, and then sign up, please, on the interested party list for the Joint Standing Committee on Judiciary.
All right. How can one in an educational institution such as ours best support the efforts of the Commission, especially LD 1626, without being political?
Well, I'll just start and say, and I'll let Ambassador finish. 1626 is not political. I would dare say that your support for 1626, it is policy. It's not politics. So there's a big difference there. So I would say that your support for 1626 and an educational institute, there's no threat to you about being too political. For me, I think all of the work of the Permanent Commission, but particularly 1626, given its historic nature and its Maine's own history. Educational institutions play a very large role in telling the truth, in teaching the truth, and not from the perspective of colonizers and a white gaze, but from the lived truth. Just like again, my mother's quote, freedom is that truth, but from the lived experiences and from the historic Wabanaki, Abenaki tribal experience. So I would say that education has a huge role in it, but I'll let Ambassador Dana also contribute to the answer to the question.
Yeah, it's amazing to me what people will turn political, as we sit in a global pandemic, seeing some of the fallout around things that should be common sense and keeping people healthy and alive. I see Indigenous rights and a lot of these things we're talking about as human rights. And I think that the more we stress with people, this is about humanity, this is about people's day-to-day lives, this is about having good public health and healthy kids and taking care of our elders and what's sacred. I think that it's hard to hate up close is another quote that I really like. And the more that you can show people, this isn't about a political agenda, this is about people's everyday lives and people that have been so invisible in so much of Maine society and in America and in Canada the stories about the boarding schools, and these mass graves we're finding of Indigenous babies that were taken from their families, that pulls at people's heartstrings. That's traumatic and tragic. And I don't think, people are politicizing that or calling that, liberal or an agenda. So the more that we can connect these things, the invisibility of Indigenous people and oppression and this intergenerational trauma and attempted genocide and colonization and slavery and everything these, we've all been throughout the generations, that is coming through in this legislation. It might be policy, but we're bringing our full journey to this work. And that's not politics, that's real life.
Yeah, I would just add, and I didn't mean to be flippant about it, but it is, and Donna, you can speak to this too, but it is, there really is a difference between the policy work and the politics. And so I hope that out of today that you'll do a deeper dive into what those two components look like. There is a stream of consciousness there, but they're two different things. And I would just give two other plugs, both connected to Donna. One is let's tune into Wabanaki Windows. I mean, you can get educators should be using. Donna is the host of that. She created that platform to get the truth out. Schools, educators, classrooms should be using that radio series as part of their educational platform. And then a bill she did get through, which is the Wabanaki curriculum bill. Schools, educators should be using that curriculum, updating that curriculum, and making sure that that is directly connected to 1626. It is all the same thing. So I would encourage you to check out Wabanaki Windows and also make sure you look into the Wabanaki curriculum that has been developed.
Jumping in here, Sarah, I think we have time for one more question.
Great. Is there a particular focus for the newer statewide Truth and Reconciliation Commission that you were putting into place with Penthea and Esther?
I heard a little bit of it.
Is there a particular focus for the newer statewide TRC that you were putting into place with Penthea and Esther?
Well, the focus is systemic racism and tribal sovereignty, looking at those two things across the state. We really want to hear from Mainers of every walk of life, every background and heritage. The good thing about this process and working with Esther and Penthea is that it's very methodical. We're not going to just jump in to hold a bunch of hearings to hear folks' stories, but we're going to take 9 months from January to September. They will lead, along with the Permanent Commission, a design process. Of course, and I don't know if it took several years for the child welfare TRC process. Oops, I'm so sorry. It took several years for that process to take shape. And so we don't want to just jump in there. It'll take us 9 months to design it. I will say this, that if you're interested in participating on what we're calling a Truth Commission, we're going to be putting that together. Please let us know. Because we want to hear from all Mainers around what the Truth Commission should be focused on. That commission will determine the specific focus.
Okay, then I think we are right at time. And so I would like to sincerely thank once again the Honorable Donna Loring, Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, and Ambassador Maulian Dana for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience and your work with us today. And thank you all for this very important conversation. And again, for all the work you do. I'll note to our participants, especially those who have asked questions or those who are following the questions, several of the librarians have put links and resources into the chat. So you might want to take a quick look at some of the answers and resources that are available. So to everyone who joined us today, thank you for spending this hour with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.